they once vowed to protect and serve. But somewhere along the line that oath shattered. These 8 men were once proud members of the U.S. military, disciplined, respected, and trusted. Now they sit behind bars in prison uniforms, serving life sentences for crimes that stunned their brothers in arms and rocked the nation. This is the story of how heroes became convicts. Case 1. Captain John M. Russell, the Camp Liberty shooting. May 11, 2009, Camp Liberty, Iraq. Inside the perimeter of one of the largest American military installations in the war-torn heart of Baghdad, surrounded by miles of concrete barriers and constant echoes of distant conflict, Army Sergeant John M. Russell, a communications specialist nearing the end of his 3rd combat deployment, sat behind the wheel of a van in a state of mental collapse that few around him fully understood, and even fewer had acted upon with the urgency it demanded. Russell, a 44-year-old veteran from Sherman, Texas, had spent decades in uniform serving across the globe with quiet diligence, often praised for his technical skill, but over time, the burden of repeated deployments, sleepless nights, and the invisible wounds of war had begun to erode the foundation of his sanity. In the days leading up to that fateful morning, his behavior had grown increasingly erratic. Paranoia, emotional withdrawal, an overwhelming conviction that he was being mocked, misunderstood, and mishandled by the very mental health professionals to whom he had been sent for help. That morning, after a heated encounter at the Camp Liberty Combat Stress Clinic, an environment meant to offer care, privacy, and protection for soldiers buckling under the psychological weight of war, Russell was escorted back to his unit by a fellow soldier. But just hours later he returned, no longer in uniform, now armed with an M16 rifle he had forcibly taken from that same escort. He entered the clinic, opened fire with chilling precision, and in under a minute 5 unarmed service members, officers and caregivers who had dedicated their time to treating soldiers like him, lay dead on the floor, their lives extinguished not by an enemy insurgent, but by a fellow American in the grips of a mind unraveled by years of trauma. The victims were Army Major Matthew Houseal, a psychiatrist from Amarillo, Texas; Navy Commander Charles Springle, a psychiatric nurse from Wilmington, North Carolina; Army Specialist Jacob Barton, a 20-year-old from Lenox, Missouri; Army Sergeant Christian Bueno Galdos, a 25-year-old from Paterson, New Jersey; and Army PFC Michael Yates Jr., a 19-year-old from Federalsburg, Maryland. Each one had come to Iraq to serve, not only on the front lines but also in the deeply human work of healing the minds of those who bore invisible wounds. The shockwaves from the massacre reverberated throughout the military community and across the nation. It was one of the deadliest fratricidal shootings in the Iraq War, and it forced a spotlight onto the military's fragile mental health infrastructure. An infrastructure that had been strained to its limits by the sheer psychological toll of endless deployments and the enduring stigma around seeking psychiatric care. The irony, that these 5 were killed in a clinic designed to prevent such tragedies, was not lost on anyone. At trial, Russell's defense did not dispute the killings but argued that he had experienced a full psychotic break, the result of cumulative combat stress, depression, and perceived mistreatment at the clinic. Prosecutors, however, maintained that Russell acted with intent, citing that he had methodically taken a weapon, returned to the clinic, and deliberately targeted those inside. In 2013, after a military court rejected his plea of insanity, Russell was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Case 2. Isaac Agwigi, murder for money. In July of 2011, within the confines of a modest on-base apartment at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State, a young U.S. Army private named Isaac Agwigi made a decision so cold, so methodical, that its implications would reach far beyond the walls of his home, and far beyond the boundaries of a military installation. Agwigi, a former page in the U.S. Senate and a rising figure within the Army, appeared on the surface to be the model soldier, sharp, well-spoken, and disciplined, but beneath that composed exterior, he harbored plans that would lead to tragedy, treason, and death. That summer, his wife, Sergeant Deirdre Agwigi, was 5 months pregnant with their first child, excited about the future, trusting in the man she had married, and unaware that he had already decided she would not live to see that future. One night, Isaac Agwigi strangled her in their bedroom with calculated precision, leaving no signs of a struggle, no immediate clues, only a corpse and a falsified story that she had died suddenly and mysteriously. Her unborn child died with her. In the days that followed, Agwigi presented himself to investigators as a grieving husband, emotionally shattered, struggling to come to terms with his loss. But the truth soon began to unravel. Deirdre had been murdered, not in a fit of rage or confusion, but as part of a meticulously planned scheme to cash in on $500,000 in death benefits from the military, a sum he saw not as compensation for loss, but as seed money for something even darker. With those funds, Oguigi began building something few could have imagined: a domestic terror cell operating from within the ranks of active duty soldiers. Calling themselves Fear, Forever Enduring Always Ready, the group was driven by anti-government ideology and plans for large-scale attacks. They amassed weapons, recruited disillusioned soldiers, and drew up detailed blueprints for chaos, assassinations, bombings, and the destruction of key infrastructure. What began with the quiet murder of a pregnant woman was spiraling into a conspiracy against the very country Oguigi had once pledged to serve. But just as his plans were accelerating, so too was the investigation. Military and civilian authorities pieced together the truth: first the murder, then the fraud, and finally the attempted insurrection. Oguigi was arrested, charged, and ultimately convicted of the premeditated murder of his wife and unborn child. He received a sentence of life without parole, locked away permanently in recognition of the lives he had already taken, and the many more he intended to. Case 3, Grady Wayne Wilkes, Ambush in Auburn. On the night of May 19, 2019, in a quiet residential neighborhood of Auburn, Alabama, a town known more for college football and Southern hospitality than for acts of targeted violence, 3 police officers responded to what had been reported as a routine domestic disturbance, the kind of call they'd answered countless times before, expecting perhaps raised voices, maybe a tense argument, but certainly not gunfire. What they didn't know was that inside the modest single-story house at the end of the cul-de-sac, a man was waiting, armed, armored, and determined to kill. That man was 29-year-old Grady Wayne Wilkes, a former Alabama National Guardsman with a background in infantry training, survival tactics, and military discipline, whose life had begun unraveling after his separation from the service. Dressed in full tactical gear, including a military-style helmet and body armor, and carrying an AR-15-style rifle loaded and ready, Wilkes was not surprised by the officers' arrival. He had planned for it. Without warning, he opened fire as they approached his home, striking all 3 officers in a matter of seconds. Officer William Beekner, a veteran of the Auburn Police Division, was killed instantly. The other 2, Officers Webb Sistrunk and Evan Elliott, were seriously wounded, left bleeding and disoriented in the darkness of a suburban street that had suddenly become a war zone. What followed was an hours-long manhunt, with law enforcement agencies from across the state mobilized to track down the shooter. Wilkes, trained to evade detection and survive in hostile conditions, fled on foot and vanished into nearby woods, armed and dangerous. The fear that swept through Auburn that night was unlike anything the city had experienced. Families were told to shelter in place. Schools and businesses were locked down. A city watched in horror as the unfolding news revealed not just that a police officer had been killed, but that the shooter had been one of their own, a man trained by the military once sworn to protect, who had now turned his weapons on those who answered the call to help. After an intense overnight search, Wilkes was captured without incident, calm, composed, and without remorse. In court, prosecutors presented a chilling narrative of premeditation and calculated aggression. Wilkes had staged the scene, armed himself in anticipation of a police response, and executed the attack with military precision. His defense pointed to his deteriorating mental state, his difficulty adjusting to life after service, the unspoken trauma that can follow men and women home long after their deployments end. But for the families of the officers, particularly the loved ones of Officer Beekner, the reasons didn't erase the reality. A hero was gone, ambushed in the line of duty by a man who once wore the same camouflage uniform. In 2023, Grady Wayne Wilkes was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life without parole, never to walk free again. And while the courtroom brought a measure of justice, it could not answer the deeper, more troubling questions that lingered. What warning signs were missed? How does a soldier become the very threat he was trained to neutralize? And how many others, teetering on the edge between honor and collapse, remain unseen, unheard, until it's already too late? Case 4. Dwight Jeffrey Loving, the taxi cab executions. December 11, 1988. The night air hung cold over Killeen, Texas, a town defined by the rhythms of Fort Hood, the largest active-duty armored post in the United States, home to tens of thousands of soldiers, a place where structure, duty, and rank governed the day, and the echoes of marching boots reminded locals of the disciplined force that lived among them. That night, a 20-year-old Army private first class named Dwight Jeffrey Loving, freshly trained, well-regarded by some, and stationed just outside the city, hailed a local taxicab not for transportation, but for something altogether different. The driver, An unsuspecting civilian simply doing his job to earn a living, never imagined that his final fare would be a soldier in uniform, armed and waiting for the moment he would pull the trigger. The cab stopped. Words were exchanged. A gun was drawn. The silence of the night shattered. One man shot and left to die. Hours later, another cab, another man behind the wheel, another abrupt end to a life. When questioned later, Loving confessed with a chilling detachment that he killed the first man to see if he could get away with it, and the second, he said, for fun. These were not crimes of passion or self-defense. They were acts of deliberate, calculated execution committed by a soldier who wore the same uniform as the men and women sworn to protect others. In the wake of the murders, an entire community, military and civilian alike, was forced to confront the unimaginable, that one of their own had deliberately hunted two innocent men without remorse, without reason, and with a conscience untouched by the gravity of what he had done. The courtroom would eventually echo with the weight of these confessions, leading to a death sentence in 1996. But nearly 3 decades later, with a single stroke of executive clemency, President Obama commuted Loving's sentence to life without parole, a decision that reawakened debate, reopened wounds, and reminded the nation that even within institutions built on discipline and honor, there can emerge an individual who sees the value of a human life as expendable, something to test, to discard, to erase. And on that cold night in December, 2 men who had simply shown up for work never made it home, because they crossed paths with a man who had already decided they wouldn't. Case 5. Robert Bales, the Kandahar Massacre. March 11, 2012, Panjwai District, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. In the pre-dawn hours, under a moonless sky blanketing a rural landscape still scarred by the toll of war, a lone figure stepped out from forward operating base Balambe, armed and armored, moving through darkness with calculated intent. Staff Sergeant Robert Bales, a decorated combat veteran from Lake Tapps, Washington, a husband, father of 2, and a soldier whose record bore both commendations and red flags. Bales, a 38-year-old infantryman on his 4th deployment, after 3 tours in Iraq and a final one in Afghanistan, had shown signs of mental strain and emotional fatigue, some say even rage and detachment, long before he descended into what would become one of the most brutal crimes committed by a U.S. service member during the war. That night, he crossed through a security gate, left the protection of his outpost without authorization, and slipped into the sleeping village of Al-Kozai, a remote Afghan hamlet nestled among narrow alleys and clay-walled compounds. What followed over the next hour would be described in horror and disbelief by the survivors and later by the global community. Bales entered several homes, one after the other, and shot, stabbed, and in some cases set fire to entire families as they slept, methodically murdering 16 Afghan civilians, including 9 children and 4 women, while wounding at least 6 others. The scenes he left behind were nightmarish: bodies burned in courtyards, children found with gunshot wounds to their heads, women crumpled beside them, blood soaking the floors of their mud brick homes. In one house he gathered members of the same family, men, women, toddlers, and opened fire at close range. In another he reportedly shot a baby in the face. Witnesses would later recall that he laughed, that he showed no hesitation, and that he even dragged corpses into a pile and set them alight. After the first wave of carnage, he returned to his base, retrieved more ammunition, and went out again to a neighboring village, repeating the massacre. He would later claim to have little memory of what he'd done, but forensic evidence, survivor testimony, and his own words would dismantle any doubt of his responsibility. The victims' names, such as Muhammad Wazir's entire family, including his wife and 6 of their children, would become symbols of a national trauma for Afghanistan, triggering a furious public outcry, violent protests, and a diplomatic crisis between the United States and the Afghan government. The massacre struck deep at the heart of the U.S. mission, threatening years of fragile counterinsurgency efforts and undermining trust between American forces and the Afghan civilians they were tasked with protecting. For many Afghans, this was not the action of a lone, unhinged soldier. It was a massacre carried out by a man wearing the flag of a foreign occupying force, in the dead of night, with no warning and no mercy. Back in the United States, the nation struggled to reconcile the man who had committed these atrocities with the image of a model soldier. Bales had once been hailed for bravery and leadership, yet beneath that exterior was a man reportedly under enormous psychological pressure, struggling with financial issues, a pending disciplinary review, marital stress, and perhaps most critically, untreated traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. Some reports indicated he had been drinking alcohol and taking steroids before the killings. Others highlighted that he had expressed anger over a fellow soldier's injury the day before. Still, none of those factors would excuse or explain away what he did. In 2013, in a military courtroom at Joint Base Lewis McChord, Robert Bales pleaded guilty to 16 counts of premeditated murder, acknowledging each killing in detail to avoid the death penalty. During the proceedings, Afghan survivors testified by video, describing the terror and devastation he had brought upon their families. The sentencing judge sentenced Bales to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Case 6. Specialist Ryan G. Anderson, Betrayal from Within. In the summer of 2004, as the war in Iraq raged on, Specialist Ryan G. Anderson, a 26-year-old National Guardsman, was stationed at a U.S. military base in the heart of the conflict zone. Anderson, a tank crewman hailing from the quiet town of Taylor, Michigan, was part of a unit tasked with supporting operations in one of the most volatile and dangerous regions of the world. To the outside world, he was just another soldier, one of the thousands deployed to the Middle East in the wake of the September 11th attacks. But behind the uniform, Anderson was carrying a secret that would betray everything he was supposed to stand for, a secret that would place not only his life but the lives of his fellow service members and countless civilians at risk. Anderson's transformation from loyal soldier to potential traitor would take place slowly, almost imperceptibly, as he became disillusioned with the war and the toll it was taking on his psyche. The stress of combat, the endless rotations, and the horrors of war seemed to weigh heavily on him, pushing him toward a dark and dangerous path. While many soldiers struggled with the psychological scars of combat, Anderson's personal battles took a far more destructive direction. It was during his time in Iraq that he became increasingly disillusioned with the mission and began to develop a deep resentment toward the very institution he had sworn to defend. In conversations with other soldiers, his frustration with the war seemed to grow, but it was more than just a desire to voice dissent. Something deeper was festering within him, an attraction to something darker, more radical, and dangerous. It was during this vulnerable period, when Anderson's sense of loyalty began to falter, that he came into contact with individuals who would push him further down the path of betrayal. In a tragic and chilling twist of fate, he was approached by what he believed to be a fellow U.S. military member, someone he trusted, who had actually been working as an undercover agent for U.S. intelligence. This agent, posing as a representative of Al-Qaeda, took advantage of Anderson's frustrations and manipulated his growing disillusionment, coaxing him into sharing classified information about U.S. military tactics, deployments, and strategies. The information Anderson provided was nothing short of a betrayal. In exchange for promises of money and the idea that he could contribute to what he thought was a cause worth supporting, Anderson began to pass on details that could aid enemy forces in their attacks against American soldiers and civilians. The covert intelligence network that had been established around Anderson's actions carefully monitored his every move. What Anderson didn't know was that the individuals he thought were his allies were, in fact, watching him every step of the way, waiting for the right moment to catch him in the act of treason. In a stunning turn of events, U.S. military intelligence became aware of Anderson's covert communications with the enemy. Through a delicate and well-coordinated undercover operation, they managed to gather enough evidence to arrest Anderson before any damage could be done. On the night of his capture, Anderson was taken into custody without a fight. He seemed resigned to the reality of what had transpired, perhaps even understanding the gravity of his betrayal. But it was too late. The information he had provided had already been deemed critical, and his actions were classified as aiding the enemy in a time of war, an offense that carried the harshest of consequences. The subsequent trial was swift and shocking. Anderson's defense could offer no justification for his actions. The evidence was overwhelming, and his motives seemed rooted in a combination of personal dissatisfaction with the war and a misguided belief that his betrayal would somehow serve a greater purpose. But the reality was far more straightforward. Anderson had endangered countless lives, not just those of his fellow soldiers, but of innocent civilians, by providing the enemy with key information that could have compromised U.S. military operations. In 2005, Anderson was convicted on charges of attempting to aid the enemy and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His actions had shattered the trust that was fundamental to the military's cohesion and had left a permanent scar on the integrity of the U.S. Armed Forces. For many, his case served as a stark reminder of the thin line between loyalty and betrayal, and of the immense pressure placed on soldiers in the harshest conditions of war. The truth about Ryan G. Anderson's descent into treason still resonates within the military community: how a soldier, once a trusted member of the team, was seduced by ideologies that would ultimately lead him to betray his country. Case 7. Senior Airman Andrew Paul Witt, a deadly dispute. On a humid July night in 2004 within the close-knit community of Robins Air Force Base in Georgia, where military life thrived on order, camaraderie and shared duty, Senior Airman Andrew Paul Witt, a once promising avionics technician whose quiet demeanor gave little indication of the emotional turbulence growing beneath the surface, crossed a terrible and irreversible line when driven by resentment, rejection, and a festering grudge over a personal dispute that had escalated during a gathering among friends. He took a combat knife, entered the home of his fellow airman Senior Airman Andy Schleipsiek and his wife Jamie, both of whom he had shared meals and laughs with, and unleashed a horrific and calculated act of violence by stabbing Andy and Jamie to death in their bedroom as they slept, before turning the blade on another airman, Jason King, who was spending the night and whom Witt left critically injured but alive, in what prosecutors later described as a brutal attempt to eliminate those he believed had shamed him and stood in the way of his reputation, an act so deliberate and shocking in its betrayal of trust and breach of military brotherhood that it led to Witt becoming the first active-duty airman in 40 years to be sentenced to death by court-martial in 2005, only for the sentence to be overturned in 2016 due to the exclusion of key mental health evidence during trial, resulting in a resentencing to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A devastating resolution to a crime born not from combat trauma or battlefield confusion, but from personal rage that exploded in the most intimate of spaces, turning a domestic disagreement into one of the most haunting chapters in modern U.S. Air Force history. Case 8. Sergeant William Kreutzer, Jr., the Fort Bragg shooting. In the early morning hours of October 27, 1995, as soldiers assembled in tight formation on a grassy field at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, preparing for physical training in the quiet stillness before sunrise, Sergeant William Kreutzer, Jr., a troubled infantryman whose long history of isolation, emotional instability, and increasingly alarming behavior had been noted but never decisively addressed by his chain of command, stood concealed in the nearby tree line with a semi-automatic rifle and in a sudden eruption of gunfire that shattered the peace and sent dozens diving for cover, he unleashed a devastating attack on his own battalion, killing 20-year-old Captain Guy Sawyer and wounding 18 others, some critically, in a rampage that lasted only moments but left lasting scars across the 82nd Airborne Division, as the motivations behind the assault, rooted in feelings of persecution, paranoia, and a profound sense of alienation, came to light during his court-martial, where the Army initially sentenced him to death in 1996, a punishment that was later overturned after years of legal appeals revealed failures to properly consider his deteriorating mental health and psychiatric diagnoses, ultimately leading to a resentencing of life without parole in 2009, marking one of the most harrowing instances of insider violence in modern U.S. military history and serving as a chilling reminder of the consequences when warning signs go unheeded. These aren't just stories, they're real events hidden behind uniforms, ranks, and silence. If you think these stories should be seen, heard, and remembered, subscribe to this channel now. Click the like button to help us share the truth behind the headlines. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next powerful story we uncover. This is the war beyond the battlefield, and we're just getting started.